History as it happens, August 2nd, 2022. What we owe Grant.
Grant's compassion and his sense of justice extended to millions who were kept in the bondage of slavery and denied the right to vote based upon their race.
We now appreciate Grant's efforts on behalf of black freedom and equality, even as we note their limits. Grant himself wanted to give blacks a fair chance, including economic and educational opportunities. He urged white Americans to treat the Negro as a citizen and a voter, as he is and must remain.
It has been a source of continual wonder to me to experience the work of all those men and women who were not family and thus had no interest other than the truth, as they resurrected and shone a light on Ulysses S. Grant's life and offered me, just one of their readers, a source of pride that has lifted me up again and again and again.
It is the bicentennial year of Ulysses S. Grant's birthday, and ceremonies are taking place across the country. But for most of the past century or more, Grant was remembered as a lousy general and terrible president. Well, that has changed, and the Renaissance continues by recognizing U.S. Grant as one of the great civil rights presidents. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Those attuned to the recent Grant scholarship will often place Grant after Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson for his efforts in the realm of equal rights. And if only three chief executives could occupy a pantheon of great civil rights presidents, it would be those three.
Happy birthday, Ulysses. Happy birthday. All right, I'm a couple of months late. It was April 27th, April 27, 1822. You know, if you attended high school in, say, the 1930s or the 50s, maybe even the 1990s, you would have learned some awful things about U.S. Grant. That he was a drunk, a bad general, a corrupt president whose incompetent rule was synonymous with that failed experiment called Reconstruction. And you would have gotten this knowledge from professional historians. Just think of the way Grant's reputation compared to Robert E. Lee's. At about the same time Grant was leading Union forces to a critically important victory at Vicksburg, Lee, a traitor who made war on the United States, gambled at Gettysburg, and the result was a decisive defeat for the Confederacy. Now, whose reputation held up better for most of the 20th century? Not Grant's. Well, in recent decades, historians have corrected the record, restoring Grant's reputation. On the 200th anniversary of his birth, at his tomb in New York City, historian Brooks Simpson gave Grant his due.
He endorsed the 15th Amendment to secure the right of suffrage for black men. He's characterized the ratification of that amendment as the death knell for the Dred Scott decision. Coming from the man who was the last slaveholder to hold the office of President of the United States, such statements reminded everyone of just how far the nation had come in a decade.
And such recognition was long overdue to Grant's descendants, including his great-great-grandson, Ulysses Grant Dietz, who was at the ceremony that day.
It is through the endless years of research and compelling, thoughtful writing of many historians since I was a child that I have come not only to understand the man whose name I bear, but to appreciate and admire him in so many different ways.
So who would you say qualifies as a civil rights president? Lyndon Johnson, probably. Civil Rights Act, 1964, Voting Rights Act the year after. Abe Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, among other things. Whatever you might think of Lincoln's personal views on race, he must belong to this small pantheon. But what about Grant? His record defending the rights of black people in the South after the Civil War was obscured by the ultimate collapse of Reconstruction, for which he cannot be blamed. Writing in the National Review, Princeton historian Alan Guelzo said, "For the space of one presidency, Grant's, the slide toward racial nightmare was staved off." And just as Grant's reputation's been rehabbed, so has his tomb on Manhattan's West Side. And for that, we can thank someone else who was speaking at that ceremony you heard clips from, Frank Scaturro, a constitutional lawyer and historian whose 1998 book, President Grant Reconsidered, helped spur the scholarly reassessment of the 18th president. He is also the president of the Grant Monument Association. Frank Scaturro, it is great to speak to you.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So we are both from New York City, I have learned, and when I was preparing for our conversation, it dawned on me that when I was a kid in the backseat of the family car, and then as an adult driving myself, I passed Grant's tomb along the West Side Highway or the Henry Hudson Parkway on the Upper West Side of Manhattan 1,000,000 times, and I never once visited it and didn't realize it was in such bad shape in those days. So why don't we start by familiarizing our listeners with the work you did way back in the 1990s when you were attending college at Columbia University to restore Grant's tomb.
Sure. Well, I had taken an interest in Grant, which in turn was an offshoot of a broader interest that I had in U.S. presidents and American history going back to age 7. But since seventh or eighth grade, I had developed a particular interest in Grant as a uniquely misunderstood and underappreciated historical figure. It just turns out that Columbia is where I attended college, and knowing that I was dorming a few blocks away from Grant's final resting place, Grant's tomb, I figured, why not offer my services as a volunteer to work on staff, to be a tour guide. So I anticipated a stint as a fairly benign neighborhood tour guide to tell visitors about Grant's historical significance, maybe help develop historical programming. But in the course of working there, it became clear pretty early on that something else was going on at the monument. I mean, I had known that it had become much more obscure than in its early days when it was a preeminent national monument. This is a monument that had higher visitation than the Statue of Liberty through World War I. But when Grant fell into certain historical obscurity, the tomb's condition kind of tracked that. The private organization known as the Grant Monument Association that had built and originally administered the tomb turned it over to the National Park Service in 1959. And the Park Service never really had a sense of what to do with a presidential mausoleum, let alone an appreciation of Grant's importance in history. Combine that with a number of the trends that unfortunately afflicted much of America, especially in urban areas. There was a decline in patriotism, an increase in vandalism. Well, Grant's tomb, which occupied, contrary to widespread belief, at least among locals who think, well, it's in a bad neighborhood, it's actually in Morningside Heights on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, across the street from Riverside Church and a string of nicely maintained apartment houses and office buildings.
It's a beautiful
academic
area.
Buildings. Beautiful area. But Grant's tomb was a magnet for vandalism. Graffiti was a routine occurrence. The site was being used as a bathroom and shelter by homeless. Evidence of drug use that we would find on a virtually daily basis. Dime bags, which were used to hold marijuana, crack vials. I would have to hold my breath when I walked up the portico into the entrance of Grant's tomb just to avoid the urine stench going in. And there were, on a less frequent basis, there were other forms of disrespectful activity. We once found a garbage pail hoisted up the American flagpole. We'd found slaughtered chickens, probably part of a Santeria ritual.
So not being treated like a national park. I live down here in Washington. I'm trying to picture what it would be like to walk into, say, the Jefferson Monument or the Memorial and to see all of that.
All of this was going on at Grant's tomb. And on top of that, there was natural deterioration that takes place. It's like any structure. The monument needed regular maintenance, and it wasn't getting that. So the plaza, the granite plaza in front of the tomb was deteriorating and cracking. There was all sorts of discoloration and water leaks in the upper level of the tomb and the dome. So I, naive volunteer that I was, thinking that, well, the National Park Service will respond if they are aware of what's going on. Because the people who really made the decisions there were not based at the tomb itself. They occupied offices in other locations. So I wrote memos, one memo after another, that detailed what I was observing. Of course, very little of what I was putting in these memos came as much of a surprise to administrators. They had a general idea that there were problems at the monument, and they told me sometimes tacitly, sometimes explicitly, to shut up. We're not here to deal with all this stuff. We're not getting much funding. But I think they were more concerned than anything else about what this meant for their job security. When something happened at the tomb, when there was a vandalism incident, they would file a case incident report. It would go into a drawer somewhere, and nothing would be done. There was no security to try to curtail any of this. Those of us who were working on site were threatened with reprisals if we ever went public or ever spoke to people about what was happening at the tomb and if it came back to them. So I did this for a period of about 2.5 years. I basically butted my head against a bureaucratic wall, trying to appeal to National Park Service administrators to do something to rectify the situation at this site. After nothing was done, nothing but these threats of reprisals. And so I realized the choice that I had then was to either walk away or to press forward with the observations that I had made. So I issued this whistleblowing report in 1993, fall of 93.
325 pages?
Yes, including the exhibits. It was quite a long report.
I can see why you became a lawyer, but go ahead, yeah.
Right. I sent this report to all responsible public officials I could identify from the president on down. And initially there wasn't a response, but then as I pitched this to the news media, gradually outlets in the news media became interested. And when the first news outlet picked it up, it was NBC's New York affiliate that ran a piece on a Sunday morning news show that confirmed so many of the points that I was making in my report. And it even had me pointing out what Park Service had done. Well, that Sunday in November of 93, the Park Service had an emergency meeting at which they decided, among other things, that I should be terminated as a volunteer. That was the reprisal that I got. So you're talking to one of the few people out there who could say they've been fired as a volunteer.
Well, that'll fix the problem, right? Getting rid of you instead of actually just cleaning up the site.
Right. That also highlighted to public officials that, well, something's wrong here. What's wrong with this picture? It was at that point that the local congressional delegation started to take an interest. There was ultimately bipartisan interest that was expressed with both Republicans and Democrats backing increased funding at Grant's tomb as the media attention swelled and as more and more media outlets were covering this. I mean, this was an example of the news media actually making a difference, exploring a problem, however small it may seem in the broad scheme of things, that was not being taken care of. And because of the light that they shed on this, public officials then acted. And we got help from some unexpected quarters. The state of Illinois, both houses of their legislature actually passed a unanimous resolution in March of 1994 saying that if the National Park Service did not clean up Grant's tomb, they, the state of Illinois, would like to have the entire tomb and the bodies moved to their state where they would take proper care of it. A state could not bind the federal government on something like that, but it was such an embarrassing thing to happen for the National Park Service, for the federal government generally. How is it that the final resting place of someone who is responsible for our nation's very survival was being treated quite literally like a sewer? We pursued on another front a lawsuit with plaintiffs that included not only a newly minted Grant Monument Association, which we put together and incorporated in 1994, but also representatives of Grant's family, because there's many descendants who are still living. And the family made clear that they themselves were so upset at the situation at the monument that they had been considering for years whether to move the remains of their ancestors. And that was another thing that really sent a message to the National Park Service. So all of these things came together. 1994, the operational budget of the site was tripled. Now it started out at pretty low. It was like $126,000, I think, was the annual budget for fiscal 93, if memory serves. That budget was tripled as staff was beefed up. They put in security very significantly. So once the site was closed, they would make sure that this desecration that had taken place, this graffiti vandalism, use of the site as a bathroom and shelter and drug haven, all of those activities would cease. And it took a few years, but they also ultimately put a couple $1 million into a variety of improvements at the monument, including cleaning the tomb from top to bottom, reversing some of the regrettable decisions that the Park Service had made, such as destroying these bronze trophy cases in the tomb's reliquary rooms that used to house Civil War regimental battle flags. They put up replica trophy cases. They had painted over these murals that were done by a very talented muralist named Dean Fawcett during the 1930s. Well, they painstakingly removed that layer of paint that covered those murals so that they would be recovered.
That's
They
amazing.
they replaced that granite plaza in front of the tomb. So they did all of this in time for the centennial of Grant's tomb's dedication in 1997, at which point there was a parade up Riverside Drive and a really nice rededication ceremony at which about 3,000 people were in attendance, which looked like a huge throng by the standards of the 1990s, although it was a tiny, tiny fraction of those who were actually there for the dedication of the tomb a century earlier.
I have to think that all of this neglect had to be at least in part a result of the fact that, well, it was just Grant. I mean, we today have a different view of Grant's presidency than we did, say, 30 years ago.
Yeah, essentially, Grant in his own time was given the largest mausoleum in the Western Hemisphere as a reflection of his immense stature. He was regarded as the equal of Washington and Lincoln, and this monument architecturally reflected that. It physically reflected that. And you can say that with the denigration of Grant in the history books, much of it at the hands of the myth of the lost cause and the Dunning School, which we can talk more about.
Yes, we will.
The tomb, in a sense, was downgraded. The system, without people making a conscious decision, and of course, vandals did not vandalize the tomb because they were reading lost cause literature or William Archibald Dunning's Reconstruction hatchet jobs. But the system had very little resources to allocate to a monument like this as a reflection of this fading into obscurity and politically into outright contempt on the part of historians. Of course, his military reputation suffered. The myth of the lost cause deemed him a butcher who wantonly sacrificed his men's lives without having a real military skill, a school of thought that's been pretty thoroughly debunked now for more than a generation. His presidency was dragged down even farther. And I think that was reflected in the condition of that monument. I'll make another point too. You know, on the mall itself, or to be very technical, just adjoining the mall in front of the U.S. Capitol on the west side in what is known as Union Square, a little patch of ground called Union Square in front of the reflecting pool, there's yet another monument, a beautiful equestrian memorial to Grant.
Amazing statues.
Amazing. It is such a wonderful synthesis of the very traditional neoclassical, hero on his horse on a pedestal. Very well done. And here you had a monument that was placed in front of one of the most visible landmarks in America, yet it strangely became invisible to us. Very few people know, if you ask them, that there is a Grant Memorial in that area, in our national capital. They don't think of the straight line of Grant, Washington, and Lincoln if you gaze west down the National Mall from there.
When I moved down here to D.C., I did not know those statues were there, and I was delighted to discover them. They're incredible statues, very dramatic, and I think they even fell into some disrepair. I mean, there's a lot of parts of the mall that could look nicer, could be cleaner.
They did. The statue, the monument became weathered and discolored, and it was only within the last 5 to 6 years that the architect of the Capitol, which had recently taken that over from the National Park Service, enacted a thorough restoration of that monument so it looked as if it was dedicated yesterday. And there's something symbolic about that monument, about its position. It's like right there in front of us, kind of reflects how central Grant was, how essential he was to our nation's very survival, our government's very survival, yet so easily overlooked.
Well, as I said at the top of our conversation here, I drove by Grant's tomb on the Upper West Side a million times. I never thought to go visit it. I didn't think of Grant a lot as a kid or as a young adult. I have a minor degree in history from Ithaca College. I think of Lincoln, and then, the party of Lincoln, Eisenhower, and Reagan. We kind of overlook Grant when we think of the GOP lineage, right? And then I moved to Washington, D.C. 10, 12 years ago, and we are in the South, and right over the river in Virginia and elsewhere, all these beautiful statues of Robert E. Lee and other Confederates, traitors who made war on the United States to preserve human chattel slavery and secession. I never saw any of those statues or monuments fall into a state of disrepair.
It's interesting what happens and kind of troubling. Late 19th century, Grant was clearly a national figure, revered on both sides. He was revered at the time of his death by formerly enslaved people as well as former Confederates. He was seen as a unifier, this amazing, colossal figure, while Lee was certainly revered by those who had fought for the Confederacy or backed that cause, but he was very clearly a sectional figure. In the 20th century, in some ways, the comparative status of the two men switched so that Lee became this sort of national, I would say not even just in the South, but even nationally speaking, was seen as this great American. You could argue second only to Abraham Lincoln in how great he was depicted as a leader and how revered he was.
Lost cause mythology.
Right. And Grant increasingly becomes this sectional figure. Lee had his birthday recognized as an official holiday in a good number of states. Even Kentucky, which fought for the Union, had its birthday a holiday. A few states also had Jefferson Davis's birthday as a national holiday. Well, zero states gave Grant that distinction, although in the late 1880s, there was actually a drive by veterans of both the Union and the Confederacy to push for a federal holiday, for Grant's birthday to be recognized as a federal holiday, something that obviously didn't materialize. But yeah, there was a radical change in the way the two figures were depicted for much of the 20th century.
So let's dive into Grant's presidency, because not only has the tomb been rehabilitated, his reputation among historians, and you were one of the first historians, you wrote a book in the 1990s to start rehabbing Grant's reputation. So let's touch on what was happening in the country when Grant takes office in 1869, because it's easy to forget that the late 1860s were a very difficult and bitter time in the United States. Grant was facing what may have been an impossible task to protect the rights of Black Americans in a country where a majority of the citizenry did not support full equality.
Sure. So after the Civil War, there are grave questions facing the country about how the former Confederate states will be restored to the Union, and what will the status be of these roughly 4 million enslaved people who have just been liberated? What is the meaning of that freedom? Well, Lincoln, of course, is assassinated at the virtual end of the Civil War, 5 days after Appomattox, after Lee surrenders to Grant. He is assassinated. Andrew Johnson comes in, and the former Confederate states feel emboldened to try to revert the former slave to a condition as closely resembling slavery as possible. So they passed a number of what were known as black codes that barred those who were Black from renting, leasing, voting, jury service, carrying guns without a license. There were strict labor provisions restricting their ability to do work of their choosing. Congress decides to respond to this with civil rights measures. Notably, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 establishes that everyone shall have the same right to buy, sell, lease, contract. They would lay out all of these rights that were being taken away that white people would have. And that Congress wound up having to push this into law over Andrew Johnson's veto, because Johnson became the enabler of the most recalcitrant white Southerners who wanted to recover whatever they could of the Confederate cause with these regressive measures. So Grant finds himself, at this point, he's general in chief. In this tug of war between the president and Congress, he finds himself, as much of the country is, increasingly put off by what the former Confederate states are doing, what Andrew Johnson is doing. There's quite a rift between him and President Johnson. Congress proposes a 14th Amendment to the Constitution that, among many other things that it does, you have a whole program, teach a whole course, of course, on the 14th Amendment. But among other things, it provides for the equal protection of the laws, doesn't directly address voting rights.
That's for the 15th.
Yeah, that's right. So in 1868, there is this concern that with ongoing repression, violence, the Ku Klux Klan, which starts off as a social club, quickly becomes a paramilitary organization, wreaking havoc, doing whatever they can through violence to terrorize these former slaves so that, among other things, they don't achieve political power. Well, Congress during this period puts most of the former Confederacy, 10 of the 11 states, into military districts. They implement military Reconstruction. And Grant is essentially presiding over this as general in chief. The question is, okay, what kind of civil government do we return to? What is the status going to be of these former slaves? A couple months before Grant's election in 1868, when he's the Republican nominee for president, the state of Georgia, despite having just embraced the suffrage for former slaves in its own constitution, winds up going back on that. They expel Black legislators from their state legislature. There is a sense that is growing that a federal constitutional guarantee is needed to protect voting rights. Grant was reluctant to run for president. He told his friend, William Sherman, the other great lieutenant who had served under him, he said that although $50 million could not compensate him for being president, he felt that there was a need in the South for some strong power to, as he put it in his words, to protect the Negroes and Union men against legal oppression or the acts of badly disposed ex-rebels. Now, a 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which provides this guarantee against racial discrimination in voting, was proposed by the House and Senate within a week before Grant's inauguration in March of 1869. But ratification by the states would take nearly another year, and it was far from a foregone conclusion. I mean, the vast majority of even free Blacks had been denied the right to vote during the Civil War. The exceptions were in the New England states, other than Connecticut, which was a region with a small Black population, and under very limited circumstances in 3 other states. Now, a significant expansion of those voting rights would occur in 1867, in most cases by congressional enactments that were directed to the southern states, but Republicans suffered an electoral backlash that year. You mentioned the lack of enthusiasm for equal rights. Well, post-war referendums, state referendums in numerous northern and western states were rejecting Black suffrage. So it was a real challenge to get a federal constitutional amendment ratified, but Grant was able to do it. He did the arm twisting that was necessary. He signed into law legislation that provided that the 3 states that remained under military rule when he was inaugurated would have to ratify the 15th Amendment in order to be restored to civilian rule. He addressed the impasse on what do we do about Georgia. He requested, after Congress kind of dithering, he requested that Georgia be returned to military rule until they complied, which in fact happened. So between that and individual appeals that Grant makes to the states, he gets this 15th Amendment ratification secured. And he sees it, many Americans at that point see it as one of the greatest acts of any kind, certainly among constitutional amendments in American history up to that time.
So, Frank, I actually don't know a lot about Grant's presidency. Most of my knowledge about Grant deals with the Civil War. And in a recent issue of the National Review, Alan Guelzo, great historian, wrote an essay about Grant as a civil rights president. And I guess it never dawned on me that he was the president during this time when the federal government had to send the military down into the South to enforce the law. This is where Grant had to take a step that he was reluctant to, but ultimately it was what was necessary.
Yes, what posed a serious obstacle to equal rights since even before Grant became president is one of the reasons he entered under such critical circumstances was there was rampant mob violence perpetrated by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So this remains the case in the immediate aftermath of the 15th Amendment's ratification in 1870. A number of jurisdictions, not as much in the Upper South, although both the Carolinas, North and South, had been suffering from murders. Grant is, on a number of occasions, asked to provide troops to quell the violence that is aimed at former slaves and their white Republican allies in some cases. Grant in North Carolina winds up sending a regiment to suppress violence and maintain the law after he was requested that assistance by the governor of that state, William Holden. But there was sometimes backlash. Holden's tactics toward the Klan in North Carolina were really aggressive. They included some illegal arrests without charge, and they were accompanied by allegations of mistreatment of prisoners. And that fueled a backlash in other parts of the state of North Carolina, which led to a Democratic victory in the 1870 legislative elections. And now the governor of North Carolina, Holden, would be impeached and removed the following year. Wow. But the state would retain Republican governors for a good number of years. Now, the situation was much more dire in South Carolina.
Before we get to South Carolina, sorry to interrupt, Frank, North Carolina was the first state where Grant sends in the army, right?
Well, he had pushed for the reversion of Georgia to military rule, so he did push for that intervention even beforehand. But North Carolina is the first of a good number where he gets a specific call from a governor to come in and use troops, beyond the use of the military that already had prevailed during military rule.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So then, yes, South Carolina. But before he sends the army down there, he needs Congress to act. We're talking 1870, 1871.
Yeah, so Grant pushes through Congress a series of 5 enforcement acts between 1870 and 1872. This is to put teeth into these newly conferred, not only 15th Amendment rights, but also 14th Amendment rights. And Grant is a very effective legislative president. He also pushes through the creation of a new Department of Justice, which is the most important consolidation of the federal government's law enforcement authority in its history. So these measures all help him out. And one of the really conspicuous of these enforcement acts comes about amid the really dire situation in South Carolina, and also acknowledging the limitations that a governor like Holden had in North Carolina. So one of these enforcement acts, known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, passed in April of 1871, actually came after Grant made a personal appeal. He went to the Capitol building after Congress itself had not been really stepping up on this. Well, they passed this law, which, although much of it was eviscerated during the 1890s, it was repealed. Much of it was repealed during the second Grover Cleveland administration, and to a lesser extent in the early 20th century. Section 1983, a provision of the Ku Klux Klan Act that survives, which prohibits the deprivation of constitutional rights under color of state law, remains one of the most widely litigated and arguably the most important civil rights law apart from the Constitution itself. Well, this is all part of this legal architecture that Grant is pushing for, that gives him the authority to act with the use of federal troops. The Ku Klux Klan Act actually goes as far as to authorize Grant to suspend habeas corpus. And Grant does precisely that when the situation in South Carolina becomes really dire and there is a spate of politically motivated murders and beatings of African Americans simply for asserting their rights. Well, Grant has his Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, who was already in the process of prosecuting the Klan in Louisiana and North Carolina, aggressively prosecutes the Klan in South Carolina. In October of 71, Grant suspends habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties. That is followed by a really aggressive prosecution that breaks this Ku Klux Klan. They basically were crushed by the end of 1872. The Klan that we know of today really originates around 1915, and
right.
has a different origin story.
So it appears that Grant was a skilled political operator here. He didn't want to be a military dictator. He understood there had to be a legal scaffolding, if you will, before resorting to military force to enforce the laws.
Oh, yes. He
to basically attack
very...
states' rights where they were being improperly asserted.
This is an aspect of Grant's presidency that was really controversial to a point that we may not appreciate so much in an age when we often accept assertions of federal authority. Right. And I think in some cases too casually look at federal authority as being unlimited.
And there was no federal authority in the South after the Civil War until...
Well, the Reconstruction amendments were a profound reshaping of our constitutional order, reflecting the notion that everyone has, by virtue of birth or naturalization in the United States, there is a nationally recognized citizenship with rights, privileges, and immunities that attach to that. And the federal government was deemed to have the power to protect these rights. And that is the challenge that Grant faced. And he understood that so many of his critics, and this became the dominant view in much of the 20th century, even at a time when other aspects of federal authority were being increased, that even what Grant did was deemed revolutionary and not in a good way by those who questioned whether these former slaves had what it took to be citizens. Many of them adhered to the racialist notions, the notion that they belonged to an inferior race, the notion that was later championed by the Dunning School. And a good number of the intellectual elites of Grant's time, and this plays into part of why his presidency was disrespected and disparaged for so many years, they saw much of this activity on his part as a threat to the Republican ideal. There was a worry that Grant was asserting himself with monarchical and militaristic repression. They threw around the charge of Caesarism.
To give people an idea of what Grant and his administration were dealing with, in South Carolina, after the state had been readmitted to the Union, because of the black majority in South Carolina, Alan Guelzo points out that there were 79,000 enfranchised black voters to 46,000 white ones. So the first Reconstruction legislature in that state had 78 black lawmakers against only 46 whites. So the Redeemers obviously would not stand for that, and they used violence to try to undo that. But Grant and Ackerman, they prevail in South Carolina. They crush the Klan. They prosecute people who are trying to return to the glory days of the 1850s. But this becomes difficult to do all over the South, right? And eventually Ackerman hands in his resignation.
Ackerman, as effective and celebrated as he is as Attorney General, only serves for about a year. But his successor, George Williams, actually was responsible for pushing multiple times more prosecutions of violence and other violations of civil rights and the voting rights of formerly enslaved people in the South. But the program, it does run into an increasing fatigue with and an outright opposition to Reconstruction, to these measures of intervention in the South among white Northerners. Now, it's one thing, as you could imagine, white Southerners are not going to be very pleased with these tactics. But Grant relies politically upon the Northern population. Once their support wavers, and it even reaches the point of opposition, kind of comparable to unpopular wars of living memory, well, this becomes a real challenge. So on top of everything that's going on, you do have this radical reworking of the former Confederate states, where in the Deep South, especially in states like South Carolina, which have strong black majorities in their population, you do have these numbers where, wow, there's an actual multiracial democracy that is in effect. You have black office holders who are being elected on the federal and state and local level. Now, in 1872, white Southerners, with a few exceptions that year, regain their own right to vote with an Amnesty Act. They're opposed to black political power in great enough numbers that a racial party line defined much of the divide between the Democratic and Republican parties in the South. That fueled much of the drive by Southern whites to redeem, as the term was known, to redeem the African-American supported Republican governments with Democratic governments. That was a goal that tended to be pursued with the most abusive behavior by whites where Black citizens were most numerous, in places like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So even after the Klan's demise, white Southern resistance would continue in forms that combined some Klan tactics with social ostracism and economic pressure as more subtle methods of intimidation. The African American voter turnout for Republicans did increase in some Southern states during this period of the mid-1870s. But during that period, more white voters who had abstained from voting came to the polls than Blacks who had not previously voted. And that expedited a number of Democratic state takeovers.
The white majority opposed to Black equality in the South. They're using extrajudicial or extra legal measures to win back power. So then they can then legalize discrimination. Jim Crow does not begin in, you see inklings of it, right? But Jim Crow comes a little bit later.
The historians often, when they do the really compressed version of this history, grossly oversimplified version, they sometimes write as if Jim Crow is there in the 1870s, or maybe all of a sudden 1877. Well, there we go. We have Jim Crow with Rutherford Hayes' withdrawal of the last remaining troops that are in the South. That's not quite the way it happened, but it is interesting. And it shows you just how significant a President Grant was and how much of a difference it made having Grant in office versus having Rutherford B. Hayes or others in office, that historians would traditionally define the end of Reconstruction with the end of that military presence in the South and the Southern states. The more nuanced and I think correct depiction of what happened is that the use of military in the South is quite controversial. That is quickly repudiated when Hayes comes in. And you could argue that there was no political constituency to sustain that particular tactic. But it is incorrect to assume that Grant's immediate Republican successors did not believe in the Reconstruction amendments. They very much believed in them. They believed in a multiracial democracy. And you see this in the rhetoric of presidents from Hayes, especially from Hayes to Benjamin Harrison. You have the span of 4 presidencies over a generation between the late 1870s and the early 1890s. During that period, there are some 1,200 voting rights prosecutions that are conducted by these various administrations, all, by the way, enforcing laws, legal architecture that had been put in place by Ulysses S. Grant. In the 1890 to 91, Benjamin Harrison proposes a federal elections bill, which looks like a reversion to the kinds of more aggressive federal civil rights and voting rights protections that were employed during the Grant years. And Henry Cabot Lodge actually pushes this election bill, which winds up being killed by a Senate filibuster. The death of that federal elections bill is the last gasp of the federal government, at least the political branches, attempting to protect civil rights or voting rights. What follows there is you have an emboldened South that really, starting in 1890 in a number of states, then implement the Jim Crow era. They wind up requiring segregation. Grant in his time, by the end of his presidency, he's actually pushed successfully for the nation's first desegregation law of national scope, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which desegregates various modes of public accommodations and transportation. Well, the Supreme Court, going back on the original meaning of the 14th Amendment, find a contorted textual argument for striking down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and the civil rights cases of 1883. Well, the South in the 1890s now finds itself emboldened to actually require segregation in public accommodations. And then when it comes to voting rights, now there had been a suppression of African American votes between the 1870s, especially after Grant leaves office in the 1880s. But they were still voting well into double digits. If you look at the percentage of the vote, well, that nosedives into the single digits, almost zero, by the 1900s and 1910s due to a number of measures such as grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes. So they are basically nullifying the 15th Amendment and much of the 14th Amendment. But it takes a generation after Grant.
Yeah, C. Van Woodward has written the great book about the strange career of Jim Crow. So a number of factors here would explain Reconstruction's failure. Exhaustion on the part of the North, withdrawing the military because there was a backlash in the North. The fact that the Southern majority of whites would stop at nothing to repeal racial equality. And there were a couple of other factors, too, when you say there was a depression in 1873, and Grant's administration was also hurt by some corruption scandals as well.
Well, there's a lot packed into what you just said. I think that the overriding reason that Reconstruction collapsed, and while you can say that it failed, and there are many dimensions to the term failure, I tend to describe it as collapsing. When it lasted, there was multiracial democracy. Dunning School historians often exaggerated the level of corruption, which was basically a constant in much of our history, certainly in the late 19th century, and was not more pronounced because a particular government allowed its African-American citizens to vote. That was a racialist distortion of much of the history. But while I do think that the Depression of the 1870s certainly helped divert an appetite for civil rights, you know, the 1880s were mostly a boom decade, with the exception of a brief depression in 1884. And there were presidents, again, Garfield, Arthur, they wanted to see this thing turned around. But the changed economic circumstances, I don't think, really made that much of a difference. I think overwhelmingly you had culturally ingrained attitudes, a strong resistance movement that occurred in the South among white Southerners that would not give up. And you had, on the other side, a diminution of respect for these rights and these strong measures that were made to protect these rights by white Northerners. You can say, and this is a really troubling component of our history, but it is a component of our history, that if the popular will is not there to enforce the Constitution will not be enforced. We like to think, and of course...
Does not enforce itself.
Right. Now, on the corruption thing, that's a whole other discussion, but I think that historians had largely gotten the issue wrong.
Well, we can talk about it here. I mean, there were scandals, but Grant was not himself involved in any, and many, many presidential administrations have been hurt by scandals, damaged by scandals that didn't involve the president himself.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, an interesting thing about how historians assess presidencies, if you think about it, historians do not fundamentally define a presidency in terms of the misdeeds of subordinates unless that president is named Grant or Harding. And not coincidentally, those were two presidents that historians long considered politically unsympathetic. But what I found really interesting, this is a really underdeveloped area of presidential history. Surveys of misdeeds and misconduct in the executive branch are almost non-existent. One of the sole exceptions to that was a survey that was done, interestingly enough, by C. Van Woodward, collecting works by a number of historians during the Nixon impeachment inquiry in 1974. He had a dozen historians who contributed individual chapters trying to develop a survey on presidential misconduct. One of those historians, James Banner, actually updated this 1974 book with an edition that takes it through Barack Obama. And he very interestingly said, to write the history of presidencies through misconduct is completely to misconstrue the nature of presidencies. And he took the example of Harry Truman's presidency. He said, Truman's presidency was one of the most corrupt in the 20th century, but that wasn't the story. Banner says the real story consisted of issues like the Berlin airlift and the Marshall Plan. And if you try to write the history of the Truman administration on the grounds of the misconduct of the White House, you're not really writing the history of the Truman administration.
You miss a lot.
This despite the fact that Truman actually did suffer from the corruption issue. his party suffered from it in a way that Grant did not in his own time. In 1952, when people talked about the mess in Washington, it was one of the things that Republicans ran on when Eisenhower won the presidency. And Truman, it was, I think, recognized, did not have the political steam to run again. But for presidents, again, not named Grant or Harding, this goes down the memory hole. It goes down the amnesia hole because we recognize in their cases that the presidency is about domestic and foreign policy issues and not about these other sort of tabloid issues, which, again, I don't think were really remarkable in Grant's case. You could also look at a whole other dimension of presidents who really should be singled out for corruption because
I can think of a couple.
they themselves were engaged in misconduct. And historians have a very mixed track record of appreciating that. The Grant corruption narrative, the notion that corruption was this fundamental defining component of Grant's presidency, that was a fixture among many of the intellectual elites who dominated the literature of that time. But it was not something that actually dragged his presidency down. And in fact, in 1876, 76 to 77, you have this contested election between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, a crisis that is accompanied by threats of violence and undoing the entire legal order. We are wondering, for the first time since really the only time since 1860, the only time other than 1860, will there be a peaceful transition of presidencies from Grant to his successor, whether it's Hayes or Tilden? And Grant exerts his authority, and by even people like his arch rival in the Republican Party, James Blaine, asserted later on that it was Grant's moral standing, his respect for the law, the command that he showed, sending the message, I'm going to be impartial here. We're going to make sure that there is a peaceful presidential transition. There will be no nonsense. Grant had a lot of moral capital at a time when, if you were to make a case about the corruption issue, he had two cases that had just erupted earlier in 1876 that had been, you would think, prominent in the public mind, with the whiskey ring trial that included the indictment and the trial of a private secretary of his and his Secretary of War, William Belknap, who underwent an impeachment trial. Well, Grant had enough moral capital that he was able to effect the last achievement of his presidency that leads to the peaceful transition of presidential power. And quite interestingly, in 76, for all that a rabidly partisan Democratic House of Representatives tried to do to cast the Grant administration, they tried with a level of zeal that is very hard to overstate. They had about 33 congressional committees that were scouring the executive branch, looking for whatever they could cast as corruption. Well, they came up with very little. In fact, besides Belknap, if you wanted to put that in that category, they really came up with no malfeasance among Grant's top serving subordinates. And the Republican Party actually winds up holding power and gaining seats in Congress in 1876. So it's in part wishful thinking by historians who are in many ways the intellectual descendants of Grant's vitriolic intelligentsia, not that term was used at that point, but the intellectual elite who controlled many of the nation's most prominent newspapers and were seen as large influences on later historians. I think Henry Adams is a name that may loom above all of the others. Those historians wound up casting this ahistorical notion of Grant's presidency to a point that in 1982, one of these silly presidential historians polls where they asked historians to rank the presidents. Well, in 1982, when Nixon was on the ballot for the first time, historians in a poll, in the Murray Blessing poll, which surveyed over 800 PhD history faculty members, they actually rated Nixon above Grant and Harding, which suggests that the historical profession completely misconstrued corruption during that period. This is someone who 4 years after retiring came very close to being nominated to a third term to the White House, far from being someone who was discredited or seen the way, people would see Nixon.
I'd like to return to the subject of Reconstruction and the collapse of Reconstruction, to use your term rather than to say it failed. in the end, without the military there in the South to enforce the law and physically protect black people from terrorist behavior, right? It probably would have taken a generation of military occupation. And that is an uncomfortable aspect of our history to think about that.
Yes, in fact, Grant said precisely that afterwards, that it would have taken a sustained period of military rule, that period when regular elections were not taking place, postpone the whole issue of suffrage and have a more protracted military rule. But Grant also continued when he made this observation that problem is our institutions would not sustain that. The people would not sustain such a protracted period where you don't have the normal functions of representative democracy in place.
That's right. And the backlash could have even been more intense. So because of the way history turned out and because of the way Reconstruction ended and then was remembered by professional historians for basically a century, no one called Ulysses S. Grant a civil rights president. I'll give you an example of this. A couple of years ago here in Washington, I went to an event with Robert Caro, I've read all of his LBJ volumes and I'm waiting for the fifth one, as is everyone else.
We all are, yes.
Yeah. He said that LBJ was the greatest president for blacks since Abraham Lincoln. Now, the bar is pretty low because many presidents didn't do much for African Americans. But, he skipped over Grant as well. You obviously don't do that. You say that he's not only a civil rights president, but was a great president.
Yeah, those attuned to the recent Grant scholarship will often place Grant after Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson for his efforts in the realm of equal rights. And if only three chief executives could occupy a pantheon of great civil rights presidents, it would be those three. Now, numerical ranking from there, even as a matter of a single category of achievement, might not make much sense. Now, the argument for putting Lincoln on top would rest on emancipation. A convincing argument could be made that the emancipation of slaves was the greatest single step toward equality for any group of Americans, and that it was a prerequisite for the progress on race that followed. But does that surpass the cumulative total of measures in the other two administrations that actually amounted to civil and political equality? Now, Johnson's civil rights achievements can be said to extend beyond race to other categories of discrimination, including sex and age, that were not substantially covered during the 19th century. But racial caste was so distinctive as to pose a uniquely grave impediment to America's ability to achieve its ideals of liberty and equality. Now, in that area, Johnson could point primarily to three legislative achievements: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Fair Housing Act of 1968. But the constitutional foundations for these achievements were already in place, thanks in part to his predecessor 90 years earlier. And other groundwork had been laid by the Supreme Court's repudiation of segregation, plus new civil rights acts in 1957 and 1960 during the decade before Johnson's ascension to the presidency. Grant secured the addition to the Constitution of voting rights, which was really the true culmination of political equality, regardless of race. And as I mentioned, he added to that 5 enforcement acts covering all the Reconstruction amendments, a Department of Justice, even an anti-segregation law. Now, the 1964 and 65 acts addressed Jim Crow measures that arose after Grant's time, and the 64 Act carried the desegregation principle farther than the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which the Supreme Court had struck down in 1883, as I mentioned. But Grant started with less of a foundation in place for equal rights when he was inaugurated, and he had to really traverse more territory, executive as well as legislative, than Johnson did. Now, as violent as white Southern resistance to civil rights was during the 1960s, it was an order of magnitude greater during Reconstruction, with Grant repeatedly intervening in the South, plagued by a scale of recalcitrance far beyond that which faced Johnson. And as nominations went, Johnson appointed the nation's first African-American cabinet member and Supreme Court justice, among a good number of lower profile appointments that he made. Now, Grant in his time appoints far more African Americans than any previous president, including the first to serve as diplomats and a staggering number of others who were customs collectors, postmasters, internal revenue agents, clerks. In short, on the issue of racial equality, it is difficult to rank any president's efforts above Grant's. From his starting point, his measures were more sweeping and the barrage of obstacles he confronted greater than those of any one president during the civil rights movement.
It's amazing that no one really wants to claim him today. I'm talking about the major political parties. I recently did a podcast about George Wallace and right-wing populism. I think it's fairly obvious why neither major political party wants to claim Wallace today. The Republican Party today doesn't really claim Grant. The Democratic Party, I guess, wouldn't because he was a Republican. Well, there's something else here. We can wrap up with this. And I think it's the effect of the 1619 Project and race essentialism thinking in our country today. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. And men like Lincoln and Grant really don't fit into easy categories like that.
Yes, it's one of the sad things about the distortion of history that has been affected by the 1619 Project. That really is a racialist school of history. And of course, it's more politics with history.
It's
very
pseudo-history. It's pseudo-history.
Yeah. It is a shame because those who really want to understand the development of America as a multiracial democracy are missing out on tremendously important chapters when they gloss over the Civil War Reconstruction era. And those leaders with Lincoln, and I would argue Grant is actually the preeminent leader of the Civil War Reconstruction era, if you count it as a discrete era of 16 years. There's a great deal that's lost when this dimension of history is swept under the carpet, but it doesn't feed the 1619 Project's thesis, which remarkably comes closer to the Confederate theory of the founding than what many had acknowledged was the founders, the original founders' intent, because we sometimes refer to the Reconstruction founders as the second founders. You, of course, have had, as part of this podcast, a wonderful multi-part series on slavery and the Constitution, and talking about how many of the founders anticipated that slavery would be on the path to extinction, but with a lot of debate over the contours of that path, the exact journey that would be. But here during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, we have a reframing of the Constitution. We have these constitutional amendments that actually do implement biracial democracy. It's something that the 1619 Project would have done so much better if it acknowledged this trajectory, but that wouldn't comport with their agenda.
Well, they kind of skip over Frederick Douglass, too.
There are milestones of equality from the original founding to the second founding, and then you could even look at the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Certainly not the only milestones of equality. You have the enfranchisement of women a century ago, which is hugely important. But those who want to denigrate, really delegitimize our Constitution, our system, will sweep these things under the rug. But there's an important part of our constitutional heritage that should be appreciated here. And one reason I think Grant is, in fact, a great president is that even though presidents don't have a specific duty under the Constitution or specific role in the ratification of constitutional amendments, there is a lot that presidents can do with the power that they do have to implement constitutional change. And in the course of our history, the most profound, and I would say at least today, celebrated constitutional changes or constitutional developments that had presidential influence on them were influenced by three presidents: Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. Washington with, of course, the development of the original Constitution, which had just been ratified and had to give so much shape to the executive branch and the office of the presidency. Lincoln, who initiates the 13th Amendment, emancipating slaves, and Grant, as we pointed out, culminating the third of those three Reconstruction amendments by securing the ratification of the 15th Amendment.
Frank Scaturro, thank you for all your work on behalf of Grant's tomb and the writing of history. Ulysses S. Grant used to rank near the bottom of those presidential surveys, even beneath the outrageously corrupt Richard Nixon. But last year, in C-SPAN's poll, historians ranked him 20th, somewhere in the middle. But maybe Grant belongs even higher up that list. Frank Scaturro has a book that he's co-editing coming out soon, Grant at 200. And he's also pushing for a posthumous promotion of Grant to the Army's highest rank, which he tells me is the same honor given to George Washington for the nation's bicentennial in 1976. And later this year, he'll dedicate a historic marker at the site of Grant's summer White House in Long Branch, New Jersey. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Supreme Court is redrawing the line, separating church and state. Critics would say the court is actually erasing it. It is the unresolvable dispute in our politics, and everyone looks to the founders for ammunition for their arguments. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.